Hello, everybody. I'm Melissa Shepard. I am here to present to you today the CTA Mindset. And I'd like to thank our sponsors here. You can see without them, we wouldn't be able to have this wonderful event. So a little bit about myself. I'm a Salesforce certified technical architect. So as many of you know, that's the CTA. I'm also a certified B2B and B2C solution architect. I'm 32 times Salesforce certified. I received my golden hoodie at Dreamforce 21 at the first ever architect keynote. I am a Trailblazer and MuleSoft mentor. I have a developer background in software development. I've been in Salesforce for 17 years. I'm the founder and CEO of LizTech Consulting. I'm the founder of Scale Up Arcs. It's a nonprofit initiative that I'm building to help bring architect knowledge to those who are underserved, underrepresented. I would say women and minorities fit in those groups. I'm also the Boston Architect User Group leader, and I'm the founder and admin of the Architect Ohana Slack. And that is my Twitter if you would like to follow me and get a hold of me on there. So first, I just want to cover the CTA journey. So the CTA is something there's been a lot of mystery around it, but it's become increasingly popular in the last few years. And as you can see here, this is the CTA pyramid. So you've got the application architect and the system architect. On the other side and at the top is your technical architect. So I always tell people your preparation should be about 1 to 2 years. That's including your studying and practicing mocks. So something I'm trying to do is separate the studying and the practicing mocks and preparing for the review board as two separate things, because you really can gain the knowledge. And then if you want to go for the exam, it's a whole other strategy that you have to learn. And it's really not a test of your knowledge, but it's really a test of the mindset, which I'm going to go over here today. So I always recommend to give yourself enough time so you can do that studying, gain the knowledge, and then work on your strategy for the exam. Also, if you're planning to go into the CTA path, you want to identify your gaps. So understand your strengths and understand where you have weakness so that you can really focus on those areas to fill those gaps. You also want to work with a mentor or maybe a group of mentors. So the Slack group that I started really came out of a CTA study group that I started, and it just kept growing and growing, and we kind of use a group mentorship model. We have over 50 CTAs as part of the group now. Over 40 have passed as part of the group since last January. So we're finding that this group mentorship model really works, but it's always good to have 1 or 2 people or a few people that you can go to ask your questions. Also, I highly recommend having a small study group of about 4 to 5 people, and you should meet daily. So once you decide to really get into your intense preparation, you should be meeting with your group on a daily basis. This is like a cohort. So if anyone's familiar with an MBA program, you would do the same thing. And I had formed a small group that was 5 people initially. A couple of them passed the review boards. I brought another person in, another female that I wanted to help. And we all passed, 6 people. We all passed our review boards. It goes to show when you work together like that, you can be successful. You also want to present many mock review boards to a mentor or to community judges. I always recommend both. So I went to the review board once. I only presented 6 times to a mentor. I did not present to the community because I was terrified. I did not pass my board. You cannot go to the board being terrified of presenting, because ultimately they're testing you. They're testing your mindset. They want to make sure you can present in front of a CTO or a CIO and live up to that pressure. So presenting to the community is a great way to get over that. And also, I always tell people, have a plan and follow it. So you really want to map out what your studying is going to look like and try to stick to that. So maybe the first part of that is what you're going to study and when, and then the second part of that is when you start doing your mock review boards and when you're going to do them and what you're going to present and who your judges are going to be. You just have to be very organized, because it just involves so much work. So next, we'll go over some traits of a CTA. So something I see that's very common with everyone on this journey is they have a thirst for knowledge. They just want to learn. They want to understand things. They're always asking questions. They also can effectively communicate. So a huge part of passing the review board is being able to communicate what these tough technical topics in ways that are easy for maybe business users or high-level executives to understand. So you really have to have effective communication skills. Another trait is CTAs are very curious and they like to do R&D to see how things will work. I did so much R&D preparing for my review board, just understanding what would happen if I do this, or what if I change that, what if I try this. I was always setting up users and communities and testing their sharing and visibility. And so it's one thing to understand something by the book, but it's another thing to see it actually being applied and used. So maybe there's some areas where you don't have experience. You actually can just go into a trailhead, playground, and set things up and test it out. So a lot of people on their journey do a lot of R&D. Something else I find important is that they have experience. So just having experience out there in the business world is important. Just being able to work with stakeholders, work with product owners, work with developers, just having some sort of experience I think is critical. It will make it hard if you just come in and just start trying to study by book and then pass the board. It's going to make it a lot harder for you to draw on your experience to properly convey your message to your review board judges. Another trait is a CTA shows confidence. So when you're going to the board, they're going to sniff out if you're confident or not. So you could even be talking about something that just sounds so confident, and it might not even be correct, but if you show that confidence, you might actually be able to get by on that. So that's a very underestimated skill to have. Also, CTAs have leadership skills. So ultimately, you're going to be a go-to person, a trusted advisor for a CTO or a CEO or CIO. So you need to show leadership skills. You need to be able to lead developers. You need to be able to lead all kinds of different work streams. And there's usually a team of architects and business analysts and solution architects and data architects. So ultimately, you have to just be that center person that can lead these different work streams to make sure your project is successful. Also a critical thinker. So there's a lot of decisions that have to be made very quickly. So you have to be able to think, well, if I do this or make that change, or what will happen when this happens? You have to be able to think like that and think quickly. So that's part of building this mindset. They're also lifelong learners, so constantly wanting to learn and learn new things and get their hands dirty and things like I was in the OmniScript session just before this because that's something I want to learn. So I find that people that become CTAs are just people who always want to learn something new. And they're also future thinking. So when you try to solution, you're always trying to think, what's gonna be the implication of this a year down the road, 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road. That's always in the back of your mind when you're coming up with solutions. So you might be asking, what is the difference between an architect and a CTA? So a lot of people will consider themselves architects. They have an architect mindset that they're developing. So what differentiates that architect from the CTA? So I've just highlighted a few different things I could think about to try to show you where CTA goes beyond the Salesforce architect. So you can think about the Salesforce architect as really being concerned about the Salesforce platform. And you might have a lot of platform knowledge, right? So a CTA would then go beyond that to have enterprise knowledge. So you're going to understand things like ERPs and billing systems and other cloud systems like AWS that you really need to use as part of your overall solution. Salesforce architects know when to use platform features versus going custom or maybe even going with an App Exchange app. But the CTA will understand what will be the lowest risk for the project and bring the highest ROI. So I always say that CTAs are secretly thinking about ROI in every decision that they make. Is this the best thing for the business? A Salesforce architect would probably understand basic integration patterns. So the CTA would extend that to understand which pattern to use and when and why, and how to secure the data between all systems. Another thing a Salesforce architect would know is how to handle the data on platform. So the CTA will go beyond that and understand what data should really be kept on platform and when to move it off platform. There was just another presentation earlier about large data volumes and archival. So that's an important concept that anyone going for CTA or becomes CTA should understand. Another example is a Salesforce architect will understand platform security features, but the CTA will understand the best security mechanisms to use for each system in the entire landscape, not just Salesforce. So that you can see how the CTA is really expanding upon that, the Salesforce architect skills and the mindset. So I've outlined some keys to building the CTA mindset. So you absolutely want to gain Salesforce platform knowledge. That's at the core of your universe when you're building your solutions for any scenario and preparing to go to the review board. You also want to gain knowledge of common enterprise systems. So things like I mentioned earlier, ERP is a huge one. You want to be able to understand what kind of data is in an ERP, when data should go to an ERP, what kind of data you want to sync back from an ERP to Salesforce. What should live in Salesforce versus what's going to live in that ERP. Same goes for a lot of other systems. Another good example, Heroku, AWS. So there's usually a lot of different systems in your overall enterprise landscape. So you also want to understand some common App Exchange apps for things like document management, DocGen, billing, let's see, e-sign, all of that kind of stuff. There's usually some common things that are happening within Salesforce where you want to know some of these apps that you can draw upon to use and understand how they work. Maybe understanding a bit of the data model, understanding some of the functionality. You don't have to be an expert, but you just have to have that basic understanding because they're going to be in your toolbox to use when putting together solutions. So I got really good with knowing things like, I think Blackthorn, Chargent. I just had a couple different options. SDocs for DocGen or DocuSign, Conga, S-Drive for being able to re-expose data and files living off platform, because moving files off platform is another huge thing that can get really tricky, and you have to really fully understand how that works and how to re-expose those files when you move them off platform to your users on platform. You also really want to understand integration patterns and the tools to share data between systems. So a common one is MuleSoft. It's an ESB. That's going to be used for specific things, and you have to understand why you want to use the ESB, also an ETL. So you want to understand ESB versus ETL when you use one versus the other, and be able to explain that and communicate that. You also need to be able to answer questions and objections. You need to be able to do this precise and concise. So what does that mean? My first review board, I wasn't able to do that. I went into Q&A and I just started rambling, and I wasn't properly answering questions with the right keywords, and they don't want to hear that because really you're trying to prepare to talk in front of executive level stakeholders, and they don't like to just hear people ramble on. They don't have a lot of time. Their time is valuable, so you just need to be able to be quick and answer their questions and use the right keywords, and that's what they're looking for. So really understanding how something works and knowing the right words to use to communicate how it works is critical to developing the mindset. You also need to be able to justify your decisions and communicate value of your decisions. So not just saying, we're going to go with this, but to say why we're going to go with this and what value is it going to bring and what risk is it going to mitigate. So there's a lot of different things you have to understand and communicate when you're making decisions. Something else I touched upon earlier is thinking about your ROI of your decisions. So always think, is this going to bring more value to the business? Is this going to be faster for the users, because ultimately the users are the ones using the system. So if it's going to take a month to develop something custom, but it takes a week to get something implemented that's maybe through App Exchange, you want to go with possibly the thing that's going to be faster time to market for your users. This is a big one. So build up mental decision trees based on knowledge and know what option to choose based on the business requirements as input. So I don't know if any of you have seen mental models out there, but people build mental models on things like security or things like platform features. I always say just practice these over and over and build them up in your mind so that when you're making decisions, you can quickly draw upon that knowledge. So that's a big part of developing the mindset, is building these mental decision trees. You really want to understand risks and how to mitigate them properly. So if you see any review board scenarios, you'll see that they're throwing risks at you and seeing if you can identify those risks. So it's not going to say this is a risk, but you have to be able to read something and say, that's a risk, and this is how I'm going to mitigate it. So being able to recognize what's a risk to a project is really important. And then how to mitigate issues and risks with large data volumes. So that's where your archival strategy is going to come in. Understand when data is going to move off platform, where is it going to go, how are your users going to see it, if they need to at a later time. Maybe you have external users within communities that need to see archived data. How are you going to show that to them? So these are things that you want to think about. And I always say people going for CTA are building their technical knowledge, plus their business acumen, plus their communication skills. So that's kind of a formula to get to where you need to be to build the mindset that they're looking for and they're going to test you on. And what I mentioned earlier is be precise and concise and understand the keywords to use. That's another part of the communication skills. You want to use language that can be easily understood by the business. So you don't want to get too much into technical jargon, but you do need to use some of those technical keywords. So understanding that balance of how much technical versus how much non-technical to use is also pretty important. And then you always want to take the lead on proposing a well-argumented solution. You do not want to give options. You don't want to say, well, we could do this or we could do that. You want to make the right decision. You want to go with the optimal solution. You want to present that, and then you want to justify and defend that. So I'll dig in a little bit more to that aspect. So understanding your solution options. So you want to come up with the different options. So this is something you would do in your mind. You're not going to present them. And then once you kind of go through that decision tree in your head, that mental decision tree that I talked about building up, you want to come up with the optimal solution and you want to present that. And then you want to recommend that and say, I recommend going with this because of X, Y, Z. This will be a better option because it's going to be faster time to market, lower costs, higher ROI, better experience for the users, things like that. Those are the kinds of justifications you want to be including in your recommendations. Also, this is a big one. You want to recommend simple solutions to solve complex problems. So I find a lot of CTA candidates really overcomplicating things. And I'll say, read that requirement again, because usually it's pretty simple and they want to make it a lot more complicated than it really is. Like, they're thinking about this edge case and that edge case, and I'm like, well, does it say that? No, it doesn't. This is the requirement. How can you solve it the easiest way possible? Because that's going to be your path of least resistance. It's going to be your path with the lowest amount of risk. It's going to be your path that's going to be the easiest to explain. If the judges want to test you, they're going to start throwing edge cases at you. That's when you're going to draw upon that mental model, that mental decision tree to then say, okay, well, then we could go to this, which could be something that costs a little bit more to implement, or it could be a little bit more risk. And then you have to communicate that. Say, well, we could go with this option, and then understand those the reasons why it might not be as optimal, and then communicate that. It doesn't mean you're wrong, but they're looking for you to be able to communicate why you might not want to go with that option. So it's another way of justifying your recommended solution. Also, one problem can have multiple solutions. So there actually could be a couple of different optimal solutions for one problem. This is where you really just want to defend your case, give your reasoning, and be able to reason for or against something else, maybe based on the business process or what the users need to do within the system. And then understand the considerations of your choice. So that's part of drawing upon those mental decision trees to say, well, I'm going to recommend this, but there actually could be some risks with what you're recommending, and you want to be able to point those out. And then once again, defend, justify, and communicate effectively the solution that you're recommending. And then understand the pros and cons of each and be able to recommend that solution based on the pros and cons. So you don't want to go through a whole list of things, but you always want to maybe suggest for a big decision, and someone put it to me this way, is if it's going to cost money, that's when you really want to justify and rationalize the decision that you're making. And then understand your trade-offs between other choices. That's part of building that decision tree. And here's a big one that is really important. Understand the scalability implications of your choice. Will it scale enough? So there might be a really great option that you can go with, but you got to think, well, 1 year down the road, 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, is this actually going to scale? If it doesn't, and that's going to be based on maybe some metrics they're giving you with system growth, or how many users are going to be using the system after 5 years, will it still make sense then? So you have to really, that's where that forward thinking comes in. You really got to think down the road, will this decision actually still work and be optimal? And you want to use your knowledge and experience to make your decisions. Another big part of developing the mindset is understanding the performance, scalability, and security. So these things usually get intertwined in some way. So when it comes to security, how to secure your integrations, right? So you really have to understand all the different ways to implement OAuth. This is usually how you're going to secure between Salesforce and your ESB or your ETL or other cloud-based systems. And then another part of security is this is JOT tokens. So JOT token for server-to-server integration. So OAuth usually has some sort of user interaction, whereas the JOT does not. So that's when your different backend systems are talking to each other. Really understand things like one-way and two-way TLS. So that's your mutual authentication. So where and when would you want to use this? Really understand that, and you would definitely have that in your system landscape going to the review board. Something else you really want to understand is data privacy. Just had consent management before this, so really understanding how things like GDPR and CCPA and PII, like all of that affect your solution. If you're not calling all that stuff out in your governance, you're probably lacking some of your data privacy recommendations. Something I mentioned before is the data retention of on-platform data when LDVs are concerned and how it can affect performance. So it's one thing to understand LDV, but it's another thing to understand how it can affect your performance. So when talking through your large data volume strategy, you really have to communicate why it's a problem, where it's going to be a problem, what objects it's going to be a problem, how can you mitigate on platform, and then how can you mitigate this performance problem in the long run, which would be more like your archival strategy. How are you going to archive? Where are you going to archive? What are the triggers for archival? There's a lot to that, and you have to be able to explain that quickly within a few minutes. I always would draw a diagram. It just made it easier for me to show that and explain it. And then that goes into the next one. So your archival process to help mitigate. So what does this look like? I always went with AWS. That was where my files and data went when I was explaining that. You really have to explain how that's going to work. And then, like I said, how are you going to bring that data back into Salesforce to show both internal and external users? Also, your different integration patterns can affect your performance. So really understanding when you absolutely want to use something like a request reply integration pattern versus a fire and forget. How is it going to affect performance? So you actually could say, well, the request reply will have a huge performance impact here, but we're going to go asynchronous, but maybe there's another part of the business scenario that's telling you really can't go asynchronous. So if you're going to go request reply, how do you actually try to mitigate the performance issues there? And how can you justify going with request reply? So you really have to think about the different things. Even if you're going with something that could have implications, you've really got to argue that point and think about the different ways you can at least make it a little bit better than it would be just not doing anything at all. And then data visibility and sharing, that's a huge part of developing the mindset. Understand how like out-of-the-box relationships can affect your visibility and sharing, and then how maybe using a master detail versus a lookup will affect your data visibility and sharing. So in any review board scenario, there's always a security and sharing section. So maybe you're making a decision earlier on in the scenario that then is going to be invalidated by your data visibility and sharing. So always thinking about it holistically end to end, and if it's really going to work for your users, and if they're actually going to be able to see the data that they need to see. So I always would try to take advantage of as much out of the box relationships between objects as possible, and that would be part of my justification. So I'm going to go with this object and use this out-of-the-box relationship because then it's going to give me this visibility for these users, and that would be a good justification for doing that. Understanding value for the business. So I've touched upon ROI many times. This is just an area of the CTA that is so underestimated. Really, you're coming up with solutions that are going to drive business value at the end of the day. It's not a test of your knowledge, but it's a test of understanding how to do what's best for the business. Can you make the decisions that are going to be the best for your users and for the business that you're being a trusted advisor for? So this would be something like maintainability, clicks versus code. So are you going to go custom, or are you going to go Apex, or are you going to go with something like Flow, or are you going to go with something like an App Exchange app? So understanding when to go custom is huge. Going with simple out-of-the-box solutions can sometimes suffice for solving a problem. This is lower cost, lower risk, higher ROI here. So I always try to think about, is there an out-of-the-box solution that can get me close to what this requirement is asking of me? And then I would use that as my justification for using that solution. If the judges want to argue, then you say, okay, we can go with something more custom, but it's going to take longer to implement. It's going to be higher cost. It's going to just be harder to maintain. You want to avoid solutions that will create technical debt, so that's part of this as well. So you could even say that as part of your justification. If you get pushback on anything that you're trying to go too simple on, you could say, well, you know what, this is going to create, we can go custom, we can do this, but that's going to create technical debt. So, there's that risk there. Another thing to think about is total cost of ownership. So maybe it's cheaper to develop something custom up front, but down the road it's going to end up costing more money than just going with something that's pre-built and maybe an app that you buy. So it could be, sometimes it could be more expensive up front, but as time goes on, it ends up being the better choice. And then time to market, how fast can you get functionality to your end users? That's really important. I was just on a project recently where the users were actually blocked from being able to pay the subcontractors of the company. And the subcontractors were getting really angry. So they weren't getting paid. So they were like, well, we're not going to stay with you as subcontractors if we can't get paid. There was functionality that was just getting blocked for the users, and this was affecting critical business functionality. So thinking about how long it's going to get out there to your users is a huge part of that decision-making process. And then sometimes you got to think, does it actually make sense to do the work, or can you just change a process to fit what was already being offered by the platform? An example here is I worked with a client that wanted us to rebuild something that existed in the system that was becoming obsolete, that were moving onto Salesforce. They wanted all these dependent pick lists. It was going to take a whole bunch of time to implement that. It was going to take a whole bunch of customization, but there was out-of-the-box functionality that could be used to get to the same end result. So you always want to think about, how can you get them to that end result? Maybe there's a different way to do it, and then they just have to change their process. That's what you got to communicate. You have to justify that and defend it. And then licensing costs. So this is another example of, sometimes it's better to go with a more expensive license instead of trying to save money on licensing and then go with custom. Maybe you want to buy a different license that's more money up front, but it's going to be better down the road. So I've seen people try to go with something like a platform license and then do some customization to get around the limitations of platform license. No, you just want to go with the full Salesforce license. So don't try to create creative workarounds. Just go with what makes sense. And even though it's more money, that is actually going to save money down the road because of the other things you're thinking about, like maintainability and technical debt. Another big part of developing the mindset is understanding user adoption. So ultimately, as a CTA, you are responsible for the solutions that are going to be used by your users. If the solution is not a desirable solution and your users don't want to use it, then why did you even build it? That's a total waste of money. So you really want to understand how you can drive user adoption with the solutions that you build. So think about things like, how many clicks does it take for a user to perform a task? Do they need to go to 5 different places, or can they just go to one place, a couple clicks, and be done with the process? So that's going to be part of bringing in automation. So automation can really help with user adoption. So you want to look for places where you can automate to where you think something could be a little bit more complicated. Maybe it's a little bit more work, but you can justify the work by saying that this is going to drive our user adoption. Flow is just one of the best tools on the Salesforce platform to do that. So you can create guided screen flows to help your users. And you can also include integrations within those. So you think about maybe like a user has to go to one screen and then click a button and then go to another screen and click another button. You could just put all that together into one process and help automate that. And then also integrations can have impacts on your user experience. So talked about request reply earlier versus fire and forget. How long is it going to take to get a response from another system? So maybe you're thinking, I have to use a request reply call out here, but it could take a while to get a response and your users are then hung up and they can't go do anything else within the system. So maybe you just have to come up with a solution, because you could get some information about how long it takes for a response to come back from another system. So that's going to inform your decision there. So you want to say, well, it could take 5 to 10 minutes to get a response from this other system. We don't want to use a request reply call out here. We want to use a fire and forget. Then we can create a notification when that response comes back from the other system, and then notify the user at a later time to come back and check for the response. So UI UX. This is another thing to think about. There's another presentation I have done with someone else who's here, and we really drill upon why UI and UX is important and why architects really need to think about this. So it's so important to think about your users, how they're going to use the system, how the UI UX can drive the solutions that you're building. And one way that I recommend learning this is to do process mapping. So if you get a list of business requirements, draw out a process map, because that's going to help you see the interaction with your users and where things should happen, and give you the right holistic end-to-end solution, instead of just coming up with this solution over here and that solution over there, and they might not fit together well. You can actually see that a lot better when creating process maps. And the biggest part of developing the mindset is to become a trusted advisor. So you're not just out there giving solutions, but you need to advise on best practices. How much time do I have left? Am I over? Okay. So I forgot to set my timer, and I forgot what time I started. So anyways, here's the different aspects of becoming a trusted advisor. You want to be able to guide, mentor, justify, look at the big picture, and also just be curious. So to build the mindset, you just want to understand, identify, practice, and then review with a mentor. So, and I have some recommended reading that I like to give people, and a bunch of resources. So if you want to join the Slack, that's it there, and that's it. Sorry I went over time.